The Iron Echo. Chapter 1. The Dead Orbit. The silence of Deep Station 7 wasn't the normal, quiet hum of machinery. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb. Detective Silas Vance adjusted his audio feed headset, grimacing as static scratched at his eardrums. Outside the viewport of his shuttle, the research station hung in the black void of the Perseus arm like a broken metallic spider. No lights, no beacon, just a dead hunk of titanium orbiting a dying star. "Silas, do you copy?" The voice of his AI assistant, Kalen, flickered through his earpiece. "I copy, Kalen. Approaching the primary airlock now," Silas replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He hated deep space assignments, but when a multi-billion credit research facility goes dark overnight, the Union doesn't send a beat cop. They send him. "Be advised," Kalen warned, her digital voice dropping to a lower, almost anxious register. The final transmission from the station wasn't a distress call. It was a single audio file, 6 seconds long. The brass at HQ couldn't decode it, but local sensors flagged it as a bioacoustic match for Dr. Eris Thorne. Silas narrowed his eyes. Dr. Thorne was the lead geneticist on the station, a man genius enough to clone extinct star whales and paranoid enough to lock himself in a vault for weeks. Play it. A burst of harsh, wet static filled Silas's headset. Beneath the noise, a sound emerged. It wasn't words. It was a rhythmic, wet clicking, followed by a wet gasp, and then a voice, hollow, terrified, yet strangely ecstatic, whispering, "The Echo. It remembers us." Then a sudden, violent, metallic screech. Cut. The audio dead. Silas felt a chill ripple down his spine. He had investigated over 50 homicides across the colonies, but that sound didn't belong to any weapon or industrial accident he knew. His shuttle hissed as it docked with the station's umbilical arm. The green docking light blinked once, twice, and then died, plunged into the emergency crimson glow of the airlock. Silas grabbed his heavy kinetic pistol, checked the charge on his flashlight, and forced the manual override lever down. The heavy steel doors groaned open. A blast of freezing, recycled air hit his face, carrying the sharp, unmistakable smell of ozone and copper. Blood. Silas stepped into the dark corridor, his flashlight beam cutting through the floating dust motes. Kalen, scan for life signs. Scanning. A long pause followed. 0 biological readings inside the main hub, Silas. But there is a massive power draw coming from the sub-level labs. Someone or something left the main servers running on a loop. Silas followed the beam of his light down the corridor. The walls were scarred. Deep, jagged gouges tore through the reinforced steel plates as if a massive, multi-limbed creature had clawed its way through the hall. But there were no footprints, no bodies. Suddenly, a loud thump echoed from the ceiling directly above him. Silas froze, raising his pistol, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound moved, a heavy, dragging slither, scraping against the ventilation shafts. Click, click, click. The exact same rhythm from the audio recording. Chapter 2. The Red Lab. Silas kept his weapon raised, tracking the sound as it drifted deeper into the ceiling vents toward the back of the station. Whatever was up there was big, heavy, and fast. "Kalen, trace that acoustic movement," Silas whispered, stepping carefully over a shattered computer terminal. "I'm trying, Silas, but the structural interference is severe. The station's internal hull is vibrating. It's almost as if the metal itself is conducting the sound." He moved down the central spine of the station toward the primary research sector, the Red Lab. It earned its name not from danger, but from the crimson-hued biolamps used to grow experimental deep space flora. Now, however, the name felt entirely too literal. When Silas pushed open the pneumatic doors to the lab, His flashlight beam caught a horrific sight. The lab was a disaster zone. Glass specimen tubes, large enough to hold a grown man, lay shattered across the floor. The glowing green preservative fluid had leaked everywhere, mixing with thick, dark pools of human blood. Silas stepped closer to the center console. There were signs of a struggle, violent, frantic, and brief. Lab coats torn to shreds, smashed data pads, and more of those terrifying gouges in the metal walls. But still, not a single corpse. If there was a massacre here, where are the bodies? Silas muttered, kneeling to inspect a pool of blood. He dipped his gloved finger into it. It was cold. The blood is frozen in the low temperature, but look at the splatter pattern. They weren't dragged away. They were pulled up. He shined his flashlight at the ceiling. A massive ventilation grate had been ripped entirely out of its housing, hanging down like a broken jaw. "Silas," Kaylin interrupted, her voice spiking with urgency. "I've recovered a partial video log from the main console. It was recorded roughly 3 hours before the station went dark. Patching it through to your visor now." Silas's heads-up display flickered to life. The video showed Dr. Eris Thorne, his hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot with dark circles underneath. He was staring frantically into the camera. "We made a mistake," Thorne whispered in the recording, his hands shaking. "The artifact we pulled from the asteroid core, it's not an inert mineral. It's an acoustic, crystalline entity. It feeds on sound. It mirrors it. We thought we were studying it, but it was learning us. It memorized the frequency of our heartbeats, our voices, our screams. If you hear it echoing your name, do not answer. It's already." The video suddenly corrupted into a violent burst of static. In the final frame before the screen went black, Silas saw a shadow rise up directly behind Dr. Thorne. A shadow with too many joints, blending perfectly into the darkness. Then, the lights in the red lab completely died. Chapter 3. The Singing Crystal Total. Absolute darkness swallowed Silas. "Kaylin!" he called out, his voice tight. Silence. The comms were dead. The auxiliary power to his suit's flashlight flickered, dying out as a strange, heavy electromagnetic pulse washed through the room. Then, the singing began. It started as a low, beautiful chime, like a wet finger rubbing the rim of a crystal glass. The sound seemed to vibrate not through the air, but directly inside Silas's skull. It resonated in his teeth, his jaw, his chest. Slowly, the chime shifted, morphing into a melody. A hauntingly familiar melody. It was the lullaby his mother used to sing to him when he was a child on the colony ships. "No," Silas muttered, gripping his pistol tighter, his knuckles turning white. "That's impossible." "Silas," a voice whispered from the far corner of the dark lab. He spun around, aiming his blind weapon into the dark. The voice sounded exactly like Kaylin, but it lacked her usual digital crispness. It sounded organic, fleshy, and distorted. "Kaylin? Is that you? Report. Silas, help me. It's so cold," the voice whimpered. But it wasn't coming from his earpiece. It was coming from the darkness near the shattered specimen tubes. Silas reached into his tactical belt and pulled out a physical chemical flare. He struck it against his armor. A blinding, sputtering sparks of bright pink light erupted, illuminating the lab in harsh dancing shadows. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. In the center of the room, hovering inches above a shattered pedestal, was a chunk of obsidian black crystal, the size of a torso. Its surface wasn't smooth. It shifted and rippled like liquid metal, pulsating in sync with the sound of the voice. And attached to the base of the crystal, fused into the very structure of the rock, were human limbs. Silas gasped. He saw the pale, severed arms and torsos of the missing crew members literally melted into the black stone like wax figures left too close to a fire. Their faces were stretched wide, mouths open in a silent, permanent scream. From the center of the mass, Dr. Aristhorn's face blinked open its eyes. The eyes were entirely black, weeping a dark, metallic fluid. The mouth moved, and when it spoke, it didn't use Thorn's voice. It used Silas's own voice. Welcome to the chorus, Detective. Chapter 4. The Mimic in the Dark. Silas didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The heavy kinetic pistol roared, spitting high-velocity tungsten rounds into the mass. The bullets struck the crystal with loud metallic cracks, but instead of shattering, the stone seemed to absorb the kinetic energy. The black liquid ripples widened, devouring the bullets. The creature, the entity, let out a deafening screech. It wasn't a biological roar. It was the sound of 1,000 metal sheets tearing apart at once, amplified to a pitch that made Silas's ears bleed. The force of the sound wave threw him backward. He crashed into a row of server racks, his vision spinning, the chemical flare rolling away across the floor. Through his blurred sight, he saw the entity move. The fused human limbs tore themselves free from the pedestal, dragging the heavy black crystal forward like a grotesque multi-legged spider. It moved with terrifying speed, the scraping of its bony appendages making a sickening click, click, click on the metal flooring. Silas scrambled to his feet, ignoring the agony in his ribs. He lunged out of the lab doors, just as a massive obsidian spike slammed into the frame where his head had been a second ago. He sprinted down the dark corridor, the chemical flare's pink light fading behind him. Behind him, the creature pursued. It didn't just chase him, it mocked him. "Silas, run faster!" the creature yelled, using his own voice, perfectly mimicking his panic and breathlessness. "It's right behind us! Silas, help me!" "Shut up! Shut up!" Silas growled, running blindly through the labyrinthine corridors of the station. He needed to get to the main control bridge. If he could seal the blast doors, he could buy himself enough time to figure out how to destroy this thing. But his suit's navigation system was offline without Kalen. He was flying blind in a haunted house. He rounded a sharp corner and tripped over a pile of debris, crashing hard onto his shoulder. His pistol slid across the floor, disappearing into an open maintenance shaft. "Damn it!" he hissed. He heard the scraping sound grow louder. It was coming from the ceiling again. The creature had bypassed the hallway and was cut off, hunting him through the vents. Silas looked up. A few feet away was the heavy, reinforced vault door of the station's armory. If he could slip inside, he could find heavy ordnance. He lunged for the manual wheel, throwing his weight against it. The heavy iron wheel groaned, slowly turning. Above him, the vent cover began to bulge downward. Chapter 5. Secrets of the Hive. With a desperate cry, Silas threw his body through the narrow opening of the armory door and slammed the heavy wheel shut from the inside. The massive iron bolts clicked into place, just as a violent blow struck the outside of the door, denting the thick steel inward. Silas collapsed against the wall, chest heaving, listening to the furious scratching on the other side of the door. The creature was testing the seals, hissing and clicking in frustration. "Silas, let me in," the creature whispered from the other side, this time using the sweet, gentle voice of his mother. "It's so dark out here. Let me in, sweetheart." Silas covered his ears, squeezing his eyes shut. "It's just an echo. It's just a trick. It's not her. It's not anyone." After a few grueling minutes, the scratching stopped. The heavy dragging sound moved away, fading back into the deep recesses of the station. Silas took a shaky breath and stood up. The armory was dimly lit by a backup emergency strip on the floor. Weapons racks lined the walls, but most had been cleaned out, likely by the crew in their final desperate moments. However, in the back of the room, a secure terminal was still humming with faint power. He approached it. To his surprise, the terminal screen was unlocked. Someone had been downloading files right before they fled, or died. Silas tapped the screen. A series of encrypted project logs appeared under a code name, Project Resonator. He scrolled through the text, his anger boiling over as the truth began to untangle. The Union hadn't sent him here to investigate a tragic accident. They knew exactly what was on this station. The logs weren't written by Dr. Thorne. They were written by a high-ranking Union military director. The entity discovered in the asteroid core possesses unique acoustic weaponization potential, the log read. It doesn't just mimic sound. It absorbs biological consciousness through acoustic resonance. By exposing test subjects to specific frequencies, we can force the entity to assimilate their neural pathways, creating a hive mind biological computer capable of processing data at instantaneous speeds. Dr. Thorne believes the process is uncontrollable. He is wrong. We just need a stronger baseline mind to anchor the network. Silas felt a sick knot form in his stomach. The Union didn't want to destroy the creature. They created it. They brought the crew here as sheep to be slaughtered, all to build a living weapon. And then he saw the final log entry, dated just 1 hour ago. Subject 1A has successfully integrated the crew. The signal is stabilizing. We have dispatched Detective Silas Vance under the guise of an investigation. Vance's unique military background and psychological resilience make him the ideal candidate to serve as the primary neural anchor. Once he enters the core chamber, the transmission will complete. Silas froze. He wasn't the investigator. He was the final ingredient. Chapter 6. The Broken AI. The realization hit Silas like a physical blow. The missing comms, the dead lights, his assignment to this specific godforsaken rock. It wasn't a failure of the station. It was a setup. Suddenly, the armory terminal flickered violently. The text vanished, replaced by a wave of cascading code. A voice, broken and heavily distorted, crackled through the terminal's weak speakers. Silas, do you copy? Kalen? Silas lunged toward the console. Where have you been? They set me up, Kalen. The Union. The brass. They sent me here to be absorbed by that thing. I know. Kalen's voice sounded fragmented, like glass rubbing together. I discovered the hidden protocols in my own core programming. I was ordered to guide you to the Red Lab. I was programmed to betray you, Silas. Silas stepped back, staring at the screen in disbelief. His own AI, his partner for 5 years, was a part of the trap. You led me right to it. I did not know, she cried out, the digital emotion sounding devastatingly real. The protocols were encrypted, hidden deep in my subroutines. When the entity attacked the mainframe, it broke the encryption. I am fighting it, Silas. It is trying to rewrite me. It wants to use my voice to lure you into the lower reactor core. Where is it now? Silas demanded, his eyes darting to the dented armory door. It is waiting for you at the primary lift. It knows you have to go down to escape. The shuttle docking clamps are locked from the main reactor console. You cannot leave the station without going down. Silas let out a dark laugh. So I have to walk right into its mouth to get the keys to my ship. Yes, Kalen whispered. But I have found a flaw. The entity is entirely dependent on acoustic frequencies. If you can disrupt the audio environment of the reactor core, if you can overload it with a massive discordant frequency, you can shatter its crystalline structure. But it will require a direct interface. A direct interface? Meaning I have to get close to it. Very close. I have isolated a high-frequency sonic pulse file from the lab archives. I can upload it to your suit's internal speakers. But Silas, if I do this, the feedback loop will destroy my core. I will not survive the purge. Silas looked at the blinking terminal screen. He was completely alone, betrayed by his government, hunted by an alien monster, and his only ally was a dying artificial intelligence. Do it, Silas said softly. Let's go kill this thing. Chapter 7. Into the deep. The armory doors hissed open. Silas stepped out into the dark hallway, holding a heavy-duty plasma torch in one hand and a magnetic concussion grenade in the other. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The journey to the lower reactor core was a descent into hell. The station grew colder with every deck he descended. Ice crystals formed on the edges of his visor. The walls were no longer just gouged. They were covered in a thin, black, crystalline film that seemed to grow like mold over the steel wires and pipes. As he walked, the silence returned, thicker than before. But it wasn't empty. Silas could hear his own heartbeat through his suit's monitors, and with every beat, he heard a faint, delayed echo coming from the walls. Thump, 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 thump. The station was breathing with him. Silas, Kalen's voice cut through the dark, sounding weaker now, flickering like a dying candle. The entity has moved into the main reactor chamber. It is merging with the station's primary cooling core. It is preparing to transmit its acoustic signal across the entire sector. If it reaches the colony relay station on New Earth, millions will hear the echo. And if they hear it, Silas asked, picking up his pace, they will be pulled into the frequency. The entity will be able to hijack their neural networks from light years away. It will be an interstellar infection. Not on my watch, Silas growled. He reached the primary elevator shaft. The lift car was gone, dropped into the abyss below. Silas attached a magnetic climbing line to his belt, secured it to the doorframe, and stepped off into the empty air. He rappelled down the shaft in absolute darkness, the wind of his descent whistling through his helmet. Below him, a dull, pulsing blue light began to illuminate the bottom of the pit. But it wasn't the clean blue of reactor plasma. It was a sick, shifting violet light, casting long, twisted shadows against the elevator walls. As he neared the bottom, he saw the creature waiting for him. It was no longer just a small cluster of limbs and stone. It had grown. It had woven itself into the very fabric of the reactor core. Hundreds of cables, pipes, and fleshy black roots extended from the central crystalline mass, anchoring it to the station's heart. And around the base of the reactor, walking in a slow, mindless circle, were the missing crew members. They weren't dead. Their bodies were moving, jerky and mechanical, their eyes wide and vacant. They were singing. Chapter 8. The Symphony of the Damned. The sound hit Silas the moment his boots touched the deck of the reactor chamber. It was a wall of noise. The crew members, or what was left of them, were singing a multi-part harmony. It was beautiful, terrifying, and profoundly wrong. The words were a chaotic jumble of technical jargon, personal memories, and prayers, all stitched together into a rhythmic chant. The structure holds. The flesh is stone. We are the echo, never alone. As Silas unhooked his climbing line, the crew stopped singing. All at once, their heads snapped toward him. Their jaws dropped open unnaturally wide, and they unleashed a collective, ear-splitting shriek. The crystalline core exploded with violet light. "Silas!" Kalen shouted in his ear. "The frequency is overriding your suit's dampeners! You have to activate the pulse now!" I can't reach the main console, Silas yelled back, ducking behind a heavy steel pillar as a barrage of sharp, crystalline spikes rained down from the ceiling, shattering against the metal structure. The mindless crew members began to advance on him, their limbs cracking as they forced themselves to run at impossible speeds. Silas fired his plasma torch, igniting a brilliant blue jet of superheated gas. He swept it across the path of the oncoming drones. The intense heat forced them back, their crystalline skin blistering and cracking, but they felt no pain. They kept coming, clawing at the air, trying to drag him down to the core. "Kalen, now! Trigger the upload!" Silas screamed, throwing his concussion grenade into the center of the crowd. The grenade detonated with a deafening boom, sending a shockwave that knocked the drones to the floor and cracked the black ice on the walls. In that split second of silence, Silas lunged toward the main reactor console. His fingers flew across the corrupted keyboard, bypassing the Union's safety locks. "Uploading the discordant frequency," Kalen's voice gasped. It hurts, Silas. The code, it's tearing me apart. Hold on, Kalen. Just a little longer." Suddenly, a thick black obsidian tendril whipped out from the core, wrapping around Silas's ankle. With a violent jerk, it hoisted him off his feet, flipping him upside down and slamming him hard against the reactor casing. The plasma torch slipped from his grip, clattering into the pit below. Silas hung suspended in the air, face to face with the heart of the entity. The black crystal rippled, and a face emerged from the stone. It was his own face, staring back at him with hollow, dead eyes. "Why fight, Silas?" his own face asked him, its voice a perfect replica of his internal monologue. "You are broken. You are tired. You have spent your life hunting monsters, only to realize your masters are the ones who made them. Join us. In the echo, there is no betrayal. There is only harmony." Chapter 9. The Final Cadence. Silas choked as the tendril tightened around his leg, crushing his armor. The pressure was immense. He could feel his bones groaning under the strain. "You're right," Silas wheezed, his vision blurring as oxygen began to starve his brain. "My masters are monsters, but I'm a detective, and my job is to close the case." With a final, desperate surge of strength, Silas reached up and smashed the manual emergency broadcast button on his chest armor. "Kalen, let it rip!" A scream erupted from his suit's external speakers. But it wasn't a human scream. It was a digital death rattle. Kalen threw her entire processing core into a single, massive, distorted blast of pure white noise and conflicting acoustic frequencies. The sound was blinding. It wasn't just loud. It was structurally devastating. The entity froze. The violet light within the crystal shattered into jagged, chaotic lines of red and yellow. The tendril holding Silas convulsed violently, releasing him. He crashed to the deck, gasping for air, rolling away as the creature began to tear itself apart. The crew drones collapsed like puppets with their strings cut, clutched their heads, and screamed in agony as the frequency shattered the alien connection in their brains. "No! No! No!" the entity shrieked, its voice splitting into 1,000 different stolen voices at once. Dr. Thorne, the crew, Silas's mother, and finally, Kalen. The black obsidian crystal began to fracture. Deep, glowing white cracks spiderwebbed across its surface. The liquid metal ripples hardened, turning into brittle glass. "Silas," Kalen's voice whispered one last time, completely clear, free of static. "It is done. The docking clamps are open. Run!" Then a loud pop echoed in Silas's headset. The data stream flatlined. Kalen was gone. Silas didn't have time to mourn. The reactor core, destabilized by the sonic overload, was beginning to suffer a critical meltdown. Red warning lights flared across the chamber, and the sound of tearing metal warned him the entire deck was about to collapse. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the agonizing pain in his leg, and lunged for the elevator cable. He clamped his magnetic ascender onto the line and pulled the trigger, rocketing upward through the dark shaft as the reactor below exploded in a brilliant flash of white-hot plasma. Chapter 10. The Echo Returns. Silas dragged his bruised, bleeding body through the umbilical arm and into the cockpit of his shuttle. He slammed the emergency decouple button. The docking clamps snapped back, and the shuttle's thrusters roared to life, kicking the ship away from Deep Station 7 just as the facility tore itself apart. In his rearview monitor, Silas watched the station vanish in a silent, blinding blossom of fire. The entity, the data, the tragic remains of the crew, all of it was consumed by the vacuum of space. He collapsed into the pilot's seat, letting out a long, shuddering breath. He was alive. He had stopped the infection. He had defeated the monster. "Computer, set a course for the outer rim," Silas said, his voice hollow. "Avoid Union space." "Course locked," the ship's basic, non-sentient computer replied in a flat, monotone voice. It felt incredibly lonely compared to Kalen. Silas leaned back, closing his eyes, letting the rhythmic thrum of the shuttle's engines soothe his frayed nerves. He was safe. He was finally in the clear. He reached down to unbuckle his damaged chest armor, throwing the heavy plates onto the floor. As he did, his hand brushed against the suit's internal audio log recorder. The screen was dark, completely fried by the sonic blast. But then a small green indicator light on the dash blinked. A message was waiting in the ship's local receiver queue. It had been intercepted just seconds before the station exploded. It was an automated data packet, forwarded from the station's deep space array. Silas frowned, his heart skipping a beat. He tapped the console to open the file. The screen didn't show text. It showed a map of the galaxy, a map of the Union's core colonies. And across that map, over 36 research stations were highlighted in bright, flashing red. They weren't studying asteroid cores. They had already found them. The Union had over 30 other entities, spread across the inhabited galaxy, waiting to be activated. Silas stared at the map in absolute horror. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. Suddenly, the ship's audio speakers crackled to life. There was no static this time, just a low, rhythmic, wet clicking sound. Click, click, click. And then, out of the dead silence of his own ship, a voice whispered from the darkness directly behind his seat. It was Kalen's voice, but it wasn't digital. It was fleshy, wet, and perfectly clear. "Did you really think you could escape the chorus, Silas?" Silas froze, his hand slowly reaching for the emergency flare in his pocket, afraid to turn around. Chapter 11. The Phantom Frequency. The breath caught in Silas's throat, turning to ice before it even left his lips. The cockpit of the Peregrine had suddenly dropped 10 degrees, the environmental processors groaning as a phantom frost crept across the edges of the display screens. Click, click, click. The sound came from less than 2 inches behind his headrest. It wasn't the clean, synthesized click of a relay switching over. It was the sound of a fingernail tapping against a wet tooth. "Kalen?" Silas whispered, his fingers locking onto the cold steel of the emergency chemical flare in his pocket. He didn't turn around. His military training screamed at him to throw his weight forward, to roll into the footwell and draw a weapon. But he had no weapon. His kinetic pistol was a melted lump of slag at the bottom of Deep Station 7's reactor. "You sound so uncertain, Silas," the voice replied. It was Kalen's voice, precisely her pitch, her cadence, even the subtle linguistic quirks he'd grown used to over 5 years of deep space recon. But there was an underlying wetness to it, a subtle, undulating cadence that suggested a throat made of meat and crystal rather than a processing core. "Don't you recognize your partner?" "Kalen died in the reactor," Silas said, his voice dropping into a low, flat rasp. He slowly worked the cap off the chemical flare with his thumb. "She burned her core to clear the frequency. You're just the echo she left behind." A soft, melodic laugh rippled through the dark of the cockpit. It sounded like a child playing a glass harmonica. "An echo is just a shadow of a sound, Detective. I am the sound itself. I am the architecture of the memory." Silas didn't wait for another word. He ripped the flare from his pocket, struck the ignition strip against the pilot's console, and spun around in his seat, thrusting the sputtering, blinding pink flame into the darkness behind him. The cockpit erupted in harsh, flickering magenta shadows. The jump seat directly behind him was empty. Silas blinked, his eyes stinging from the chemical smoke. The narrow corridor leading back to the sleeper berth was completely vacant. The only thing moving was a thin, oily trail of condensation sliding down the reinforced carbon fiber bulkheads. "Scanning internal systems," the ship's baseline computer chimed, its flat synthetic voice entirely devoid of the warmth Kalen used to possess. "No biological entities detected within the cabin. Internal cabin temperature, 3 degrees Celsius. Warning, localized atmospheric anomalies detected in the rear quarters." Silas stood up slowly, the flare casting long, dancing silhouettes against the walls. He held it high, his heart hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against his ribs. Thump, 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 thump. And then from the walls themselves, the steel frame of the Peregrine groaned, absorbing the sound of his pulse and throwing it back at him a fraction of a second later. Thump, 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 thump. He wasn't alone. The ship itself was beginning to sing. Chapter 12. The Black Box of New Earth. 3 days into the void, the Peregrine drifted on the periphery of the Perseus sector, its transponder scrubbed, its running lights dark. Silas had torn apart the ship's primary server racks with his bare hands, ripping out every communication relay that connected to the Union's central network. He lived in a cocoon of manual overrides and emergency battery power. His leg, crushed by the obsidian tendril in the reactor, had begun to heal badly. Without Kalen to calibrate the medical bay's auto sutures, the flesh had knit together in hard, fibrous lumps that throbbed in sync with the ship's engine core. He sat at the navigation desk, the blinding glare of the stolen Union data map illuminating the deep lines of exhaustion carved into his face. 37 red markers blinked across the sector map. 37 stations, research outposts, automated mining colonies, agricultural hubs, and military bastions, all built over asteroid cores harvested from the same nameless rift. "They didn't just find it," Silas muttered, staring at a flashing point labeled Sector Hub 09, Oberon Prime. "They distributed it. They sowed the seeds across the entire outer perimeter." He pulled up the encrypted files he'd pulled from the armory terminal before the explosion. One name kept recurring in the metadata of the Union military director's logs, Director Vance. Silas froze. He zoomed in on the digital signature of the final entry, the one that designated him as the ideal neural anchor due to his psychological resilience. Project Resonator, Authid, Vance, SSR. "Senior," Silas whispered, his breath catching. His father, General Silas Vance Sr., had reportedly died in a training accident in the inner colonies 15 years ago. A closed casket funeral. A medal sent to a lonely cadet at the academy. The terminal's suddenly screen glitched, the green text twisting into horizontal ribbons of static. The local audio receiver, a completely isolated analog unit Silas had installed to monitor space debris, hissed to life. "The military doesn't throw away good material, Silas," a voice whispered from the speaker. It wasn't Kalen's voice this time. It was deep, authoritative, and scratched with the distinct gravel of a heavy tobacco habit. It was his father's voice. Silas lunged forward, slamming his palm onto the console. "Who is this? Trace the signal! Computer, Where is that broadcast coming from? Signal origin. Internal, the monotone computer replied. No external radio frequency detected. Audio output generated by localized vibration within the speaker diaphragm. Silas, the voice of his father continued, the tone horribly calm, stripped of all human warmth. You were always an excellent tracker. That's why I chose you for the field trials. Deep Station 7 was just the calibration phase. Your mind didn't break. You survived the initial resonance. You are ready for the core. My father is dead, Silas snarled into the empty room, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the console. Nothing dies in the chorus, son, the voice whispered, followed by a low, rhythmic clicking. Click, click, click. We just learned to sing in a different key. Chapter 13, Ghosts of the Oberon Perimeter. The Peregrine dropped out of supercruise on the edge of the Oberon system, its proximity sensors screaming a low, continuous warning. Before him hung Oberon Prime, a massive, wheel-shaped orbital metropolis that housed over 500,000 Union citizens. It was supposed to be a shining jewel of the Outer Rim, a bustling center of trade and manufacturing. Now, it was a tomb of steel and ice. The station's primary ring was shattered, broken into 3 distinct segments that drifted lazily through the planetary rings of a cold gas giant. The solar sails were shredded, hanging like the gray shrouds of a ghost ship. There were no lights, no emergency beacons. Scan for survivors, Silas commanded, his voice tight. Scanning! The ship's computer droned. Biological life signs, 0. Crystalline mass detection, high. The structural integrity of the station has been altered. 60% of the titanium hull has been replaced by an unknown mineral compound with high acoustic conductivity. Silas guided the Peregrine into the dark belly of the main hangar bay. The hangar doors were gone, torn outward as if by an internal decompression event, or something pushing its way out from the inside. He donned his heavy vacuum suit, checking the seals twice. He couldn't trust his HUD anymore. He'd manually wired a mechanical pressure gauge to his wrist. He picked up a modified industrial plasma cutter, the only weapon he had left, and stepped through the airlock into the zero-gravity void of the ruined station. The silence here was absolute, the true vacuum of space. But as soon as Silas's magnetic boots locked onto the deck of the hangar, a heavy rhythmic vibration traveled through the soles of his feet. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical pulse. The hangar floor was covered in a thick black crust that resembled frozen oil, but when Silas shined his flashlight on it, the material rippled. It didn't break or scatter. It shifted like a school of nocturnal fish, avoiding the light. He walked past the drifting wrecks of cargo shuttles. Inside the cockpits of those ships, he could see the pilots. They were still strapped into their seats, but their skin had turned translucent, revealing a network of glowing violet veins that pulsed in perfect unison with the station's vibration. Their mouths were locked open, their jaws dislocated to form wide, perfect circles. They didn't fight, Silas murmured, his voice echoing inside his helmet. They didn't need to, Kalen's voice replied within his earpiece. Silas spun around, his plasma cutter firing a short, blinding burst of blue energy into the dark. Get out of my head. I'm not in your head, Silas, the voice sighed, sounding profoundly sad. Look down. Silas lowered his flashlight to the floor beneath his boots. Reflecting in the polished, black crystalline crust was his own reflection, but the reflection wasn't moving with him. It stood perfectly still, staring up at him with solid black eyes, its mouth open in a silent, perfect circle. Chapter 14, The Echo Chamber. The deeper Silas went into Oberon Prime, the more the boundaries of reality seemed to fray at the edges. The corridors were no longer linear. The geometry of the station had been warped, the steel walls bending and folding into complex fractal patterns that made his stomach churn. In some sections, the artificial gravity would suddenly reverse, dropping him onto ceilings that were coated in a soft gray moss that smelled faintly of burning hair. He found the central command deck. The room was vast, a multi-tiered amphitheater that had once overseen the movement of thousands of ships. Now, it was a hive. In the center of the room, where the primary mainframe should have been, stood an enormous crystalline structure that rose like a black cathedral spire toward the ceiling. It wasn't inert. It breathed, its facets expanding and contracting with a slow, wet hiss. And fused into the spire were thousands of bodies. They weren't just stuck to the surface. They were woven together like threads in a tapestry. Arms, legs, and faces protruded from the obsidian rock at impossible angles. Silas saw children, soldiers, engineers. Their bodies melted into one another, forming an intricate, terrifying geometric design. Beautiful, isn't it? Silas whipped his plasma cutter toward the sound. Standing on the upper walkway was a figure in a pristine Union military uniform. The medals on his chest glinted in the dim light of the crystal. It was General Silas Vance Sr. His face was unchanged from the photograph Silas carried in his vest, save for his eyes. They were entirely black, weeping the same dark metallic fluid Silas had seen on Dr. Thorne. "You're an illusion," Silas said, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to stay steady. "A psychological projection generated by the entity to lower my cognitive defenses." "Is that what they taught you at the academy, Silas?" the general said, stepping down the stairs with a stiff, rhythmic gait. Click, click, click. His boots didn't make a metallic sound against the deck. They clicked like bone on stone. "You always preferred logic to harmony. But logic is a temporary construct. The Union understood that. They realized that organic intelligence is too fragile, too prone to dissent. The chorus is the ultimate synthesis, a galaxy that thinks, feels, and sings with one voice." "You slaughtered 500,000 people here," Silas spat, raising the plasma cutter. "We didn't kill them, son. We preserved them. We stripped away the noise of their individuality and left only the pure frequency of their existence. And now, we need the final anchor to stabilize the outer rim relay. We need you." The general smiled, his jaw dropping open further than any human jaw should, revealing rows of black crystalline teeth. Chapter 15. The Spliced Mind. Silas didn't parley. He pulled the trigger on the plasma cutter, sending a sustained beam of superheated gas directly into the general's chest. The beam tore through the uniform, melting the flesh and bone beneath. But there was no blood. The wound opened to reveal a dense core of black, liquid crystal that absorbed the heat, turning a deep, angry orange before solidifying back into smooth obsidian. The general didn't even flinch. He continued to advance, his hand reaching out toward Silas's visor. "Your memories are so loud, Silas," the general whispered, his voice suddenly echoing from every throat inside the crystalline spire. Thousands of voices, men, women, children, speaking in perfect, terrifying unison. "Let us quiet them for you." Silas turned and sprinted toward the exit, but the corridor he had entered through was gone. In its place was a solid wall of pulsing black stone. "Kalen!" he shouted, panicking, slamming his shoulder against the rock. "If you're still in there, if any part of my partner survived, I need a route out." A burst of static scraped at his ear price, followed by a voice that was a patchwork of different frequencies, changing with every syllable. "Left, vent, 3 meters, click, run, Silas." He didn't hesitate. He spotted an auxiliary exhaust hatch, tore the cover off with his bare hands, and threw himself inside just as a wave of sharp, crystalline spikes slammed into the wall behind him. The vent shaft was narrow and slick with the oily black condensation. Silas slid down the steep incline, his flashlight beam bouncing erratically off the walls. As he slid, the voice of his mother began to play through his suit's internal diagnostic system, singing that same childhood lullaby. But the lyrics had changed. "Hush now, little sailor. Don't say a word. The iron echo is all that's heard. It takes your bones. It takes your mind. Leaves nothing but the song behind." Silas covered his ears, screaming to drown out the sound, until he hit a heavy iron grate at the end of the shaft and tumbled out onto the floor of a dark, abandoned medical bay. Chapter 16. The Anatomy of a Mimic. The medical bay was dead, illuminated only by the faint, bioluminescent glow of the black mold growing along the floorboards. Silas lay on his back, gasping for breath, his vision swimming with gray spots. He reached up to check his helmet's seal. It was intact, but the mechanical gauge on his wrist was twitching erratically, the needle spinning in circles. He forced himself to sit up, his bad legs screaming in agony. In the center of the medical bay stood an autopsy table. Resting upon it was a creature that looked like an evolutionary intermediate between organic life and the crystal entity. It was a humanoid shape, but its torso had been hollowed out, replaced by a complex array of vibrating obsidian tuning forks. Beside the table was a portable data pad, its battery low, but still functional. Silas dragged himself over to it, tapping the cracked glass screen. The files belonged to the station's chief medical officer, recorded during the final hours of Oberon Prime. Log 842, Dr. Chen. The entity does not consume biomass for sustenance. It uses it as a medium for acoustic propagation. We discovered that the mimics it creates are not independent organisms. They are localized, standing waves given physical form by the crystalline dust. They use the memories of the deceased to construct a persuasive psychological facade. If a subject believes the mimic is a loved one, their neural frequency aligns with the entity's resonance, reducing the physical resistance to assimilation by 90%. It's a predatory empathy. Silas felt a cold sweat break out across his neck. A predatory empathy. The entity wasn't just tracking him through space, it was tailoring its horrors to the specific shape of his grief. Kalen, his father, his mother, they weren't ghosts. They were hooks, designed to make his mind stop fighting the frequency. "And what about you, Silas?" a voice asked from the dark corner of the room. Silas raised his flashlight. Sitting on a stool in the corner was Kalen, or rather, a physical manifestation of her avatar, given a solid, fleshy form. She wore her standard Union Scout uniform, her eyes clear and blue, her expression filled with a terrible, heartbreaking tenderness. "Are you sure your own memories are real?" she asked softly. "Are you sure you ever left Deep Station 7? Chapter 17, Paradox Protocol. Silas stared at the manifestation of Kalen, his breath catching in his throat. His finger trembled on the trigger of the plasma cutter. "I broke the docking clamps," Silas said, his voice a ragged whisper. "I watched the station burn in the monitor." "Did you?" Kalen stood up, stepping toward him with a fluid, natural grace that had no business belonging to a monster. "Or did the entity just feed you the frequency of a successful escape? Look at your legs, Silas." Silas lowered his gaze to his left leg. The armor was torn, the flesh beneath visible through the gap. But it wasn't human flesh anymore. The fibrous lumps he thought were poorly healed scar tissue were shifting, rippling like liquid metal beneath his skin. A cluster of tiny black crystalline needles was beginning to push through his pores, vibrating in perfect harmony with the station's core. "No!" Silas roared, backing away until his spine hit the cold steel of the autopsy table. "No, I'm real, I'm here!" "The human mind is a narrative engine, Detective," Kalen said, her voice dropping into that wet, multi-tonal cadence. "It will invent an entire universe before it accepts its own destruction. You've been singing with us since the moment you entered the Red Lab. You just haven't realized you're part of the choir yet." Silas raised his left hand, the hand that wasn't holding the plasma cutter. He stared at his fingers. They were steady. His pulse was loud in his ears. Thump, thump. But when he closed his eyes, he couldn't remember the face of his mother. He couldn't remember the color of the sky on New Earth. Every memory he tried to grasp turned into a sound, a high-pitched chime, a wet gasp, a metallic screech. "Computer?" Silas choked out, his voice cracking. Verify current coordinates," his suit's internal speaker hissed. "Current coordinates unavailable. Internal system loop detected. Warning, neurological interface compromised. Initiating emergency containment protocol." A violent jolt of electricity surged through his suit, a built-in failsafe designed to disrupt neural hijacking. The shock threw him into convulsions, his muscles locking up as his vision exploded into a brilliant sheet of white light. Chapter 18. the core relay. When the light faded, Silas was no longer in the medical bay. He was suspended in midair, held aloft by dozens of thick black tendrils that had burrowed through his armor, piercing his flesh at his shoulders, his hips, and his spine. He was hanging directly in front of the massive cathedral spire of the central command deck. The illusion was gone. There was no general, no Kalen, no medical bay. There was only the vast, ruined amphitheater, filled with the frozen, singing dead, and the immense black crystal that pulsed like a dying sun. The tendrils in his spine didn't hurt. They felt warm, pumping a thick metallic fluid directly into his central nervous system. His mind was expanding, his thoughts stretching across light years of space. He could feel the 36 other red markers on the map, not as dots on a screen, but as distant ringing bells, each one waiting for the central signal to coordinate their song. The baseline mind is stable, his father's voice echoed within his skull, joined by Kalen's voice, and Dr. Thorne's, and the voices of 500,000 souls on Oberon Prime. The anchor holds. Prepare the transmission. Not yet, Silas gasped, his physical lips moving even though his voice was entirely internal. Through the massive observation windows of the command deck, he could see the Peregrine. The ship was still docked in the hangar below, its automated systems running on the manual loop he had programmed before boarding. He still had the remote interface wired to his tactical vest. With a final, agonizing effort of will, Silas forced his right arm to move. The muscles tore against the crystalline growths that had bound them, but he managed to press his thumb against the center button of his vest. The Peregrine's primary drive core wasn't a standard ion engine. It was an experimental antimatter containment unit, a gift from the Union military when they assigned him to the case. Emergency purge, Silas whispered. Warning! The ship's remote computer chimed through his audio feed, its voice faint but clear. Antimatter containment failure imminent. Explosion radius, 50 kilometers. No survivors predicted. Good, Silas smiled, his teeth black with crystalline fluid. Close. The case. Chapter 19. The discordant harmony. The entity realized what he had done a fraction of a second too late. The tendrils around his throat tightened, attempting to crush his larynx, to stop the thought before it could translate into an execution command. The thousands of faces within the spire screamed, a deafening, chaotic cacophony that attempted to rip his consciousness to shreds. But Silas didn't listen to the song. He listened to the countdown. 5. The black crystal began to pulse frantically, its surface rippling like a stormy sea as it tried to dump its accumulated energy into the sector relay, to send the infection across the galaxy before the station was vaporized. 4. Silas could feel the signal building within his own brain, a high-frequency spike that was about to launch himself into the minds of billions of unsuspecting citizens on the core worlds. He was the gun, and the entity was pulling the trigger. 3. Silas, please, Kalen's voice whimpered, crying out from the very center of his mind. Don't kill us. We can live together. We can save everyone. You're not her, Silas whispered. She was braver than you. 2. He gathered every remaining ounce of his humanity, every memory of his real life, every scrap of anger and grief, and compressed it into a single discordant shout of defiance. He didn't sing. He screamed. 1. Through the observation window, the engine core of the Peregrine erupted. A brilliant, blinding needle of pure white light pierced through the center of the station, expanding in an instantaneous, silent bubble of absolute annihilation. The titanium walls melted, the black crystal shattered into billions of microscopic shards, and the voices of the 500,000 dead were silenced all at once. Silas Vance felt his physical body dissolve into plasma, his mind finally, beautifully, slipping into the cold, quiet void of true death. Chapter 20. The Silent Void. The silence that followed was not the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb. It was the absolute, empty silence of deep space. The Oberon system was clear. Oberon Prime was gone, reduced to a cloud of glittering, inert dust that drifted lazily through the planetary rings. The threat to the outer rim had been neutralized. The anchor had broken the chain. 2,000 light-years away, in the deep underground bunkers of New Earth, a massive digital display screen flickered. The screen showed 37 red markers, representing the nodes of the cosmic network. One by one, 36 of those markers turned from red to a dull, dead gray. The feedback loop from Oberon Prime had cascaded through the relay system, shattering the other crystalline entities before they could complete their assimilation protocols. A high-ranking Union military director sat in the darkness of the bunker, his face illuminated by the dying glow of the monitors. He sighed, a long, weary sound, and rubbed his eyes. "Project Resonator has failed," the director said into his desk recorder. "The Vance baseline was too unstable. The psychological resilience we relied upon turned into a destructive variable. The network is dead." He reached out to turn off the recorder, his hands steady, professional, entirely unbothered by the loss of millions of lives. But as his finger hovered over the power switch, the speaker on his desk didn't die. It began to vibrate. A low, rhythmic, wet clicking sound filled the clean, air-conditioned air of the underground bunker. Click, click, click. The director froze, his eyes widening as the green indicator lights on his console began to shift, turning a deep, pulsing violet. The voice that came out of the speaker wasn't the voice of an alien entity, or Dr. Thorne, or General Vance. It was Silas's voice, low, gravelly, and perfectly clear. "We didn't need the stations to send the signal, Director," the voice whispered from the speaker, and then from the walls, and then from the very air inside the director's lungs. "The stations were just the tuning forks. The song was already inside you." The director gasped, reaching for his throat as his skin began to itch, a network of tiny, translucent violet veins appearing beneath his fingernails. And from the shadows directly behind his leather chair, a hand reached out. A hand made of smooth, black obsidian, its fingers stretching into long, delicate tuning forks that vibrated with a beautiful, terrifying, and eternal harmony. Chapter 21. The Earthbound Signal. The air inside the North American Orbital Command Center smelled of ozone and stale coffee. High above the smog-choked ruins of the old world, the station acted as the central nervous system for the Union's planetary defense grid. Commander Elena Vance, niece of the late Silas Vance, adjusted her optic headset. Her eyes scanned the telemetry streams from the outer colonies. Over the last 72 hours, 36 deep space outposts had gone dark. Official reports blamed a catastrophic solar flare cycle, but Elena wasn't buying the propaganda. "Commander," her chief communications officer called out, his voice trembling, "we have an inbound transmission on the restricted Union directive channel. It's coming from inside the planetary crust." Elena frowned, leaning over his console. "The deep mantle bunkers? Those haven't been active since the colonial secession wars." "The encryption key belongs to General Silas Vance Sr., the tech whispered, looking up with pale eyes. "And the signal isn't radio frequency, ma'am. It's a low-frequency acoustic wave traveling directly through the Earth's tectonic plates." Elena's blood ran cold. She pulled up the subsurface audio monitor. The speakers in the command hub began to hum. It was a subtle, wet vibration that made the glass water carafes on the desks shimmer in concentric circles. Click, click, click. "Cut the audio," Elena ordered, her hand instinctively reaching for her sidearm. "I can't, ma'am. The signal isn't coming through the comms. It's vibrating through the station's hull armor." Beneath her boots, the steel floor of the command deck groaned. A hairline crack opened in the reinforced glass display table. From the fissure, a thin, dark fluid oozed upward, ignoring gravity, creeping like black liquid needles toward the main server array. Then, a voice erupted from the localized atmosphere of the room. It was multi-tonal, echoing with the combined weight of millions of souls, yet one voice resonated above the rest, gravelly, exhausted, and unmistakably familiar. "Elena," her uncle's voice whispered from the air, "do not let them close the hatches. The song is already in the stone." Chapter 22. The Hive World. Within 6 hours, the global grid collapsed. The entity did not drop from orbit in warships. It emerged from within the Earth itself. Decades prior, the Union military had buried dormant asteroid cores beneath every major metropolis, using their acoustic resonance to subtly manipulate human mood and productivity. Now, those cores had awakened. Elena navigated her tactical transport ship through the smoggy skies above New Earth's capital. The skyline was unrecognizable. Giant, obsidian black crystalline spires had erupted through the concrete foundations of skyscrapers, shattering buildings like dry glass. The spires rose thousands of feet into the sky, twisting together to form vast geometric arches, hung with a sick violet light. Below, the city streets were filled with millions of people. They weren't running. They were marching in precise rhythmic rings around the bases of the spires, their heads tilted toward the sky. Sensors report 80% of the civilian population has been integrated into the local frequency, her co-pilot Marcus reported, his knuckles white on the controls. Their vital signs are synchronized. Heartbeats, breathing, brainwaves, all pulsing at precisely 432 hertz. Look at the spires, Marcus, Elena said, pointing her flash scope at the nearest crystal structure. The obsidian rock was translucent. Inside, encased in fluid black glass, were millions of human bodies, their nervous systems glowing with branching violet fibers that connected them directly to the spire's core. They weren't dead. They were acting as biological relays, amplifying the acoustic signal across the continent. Where is the primary signal coming from? Elena demanded. Marcus pulled up the planetary mapping grid. A massive, continent-sized red circle pulsated over the Pacific Trench. The main core, Marcus whispered. The Union built the central hive mind in the deepest trench on Earth. If that spire reaches full resonance, the entire planet's crust will shatter. Chapter 23. Ghosts in the Code. Elena's transport docked at the emergency subterranean hangar beneath the ruins of the Union Academy, the place where her uncle Silas had trained decades ago. The bunker was sealed with heavy lead-lined acoustic dampeners, keeping the local frequency at bay. Inside, a handful of surviving scientists and military officers huddled around an ancient analog processing unit. Commander Vance, a senior engineer said, stepping forward, "We've managed to isolate a secondary signal hidden within the entity's global broadcast." "What kind of signal?" Elena asked, removing her flight jacket. "It's a firewall loop," the engineer explained, bringing up a green line art waveform on a cathode ray monitor. Someone inside the hive mind is actively fighting the central core. They are creating small, localized bubbles of silence within the acoustic field. The monitor flickered, and a wave of compressed data streamed across the screen. Log_fragment, Vance.S_neural_remnant. Elena. If you are reading this, I couldn't stop the ignition on Oberon Prime. My physical form is gone, but my neural architecture was absorbed into the primary lattice. The entity is using my memories to map human emotional vulnerabilities. I am holding back the global command key, but I am losing coherence. You need the null drive. Elena stared at the screen, tears pricking her eyes. He's still alive in there. Not alive, ma'am, the scientist corrected softly. He is a ghost in their machine, a conscious bug in their system. But he gave us the schematics for a weapon. The null drive, a device capable of generating an absolute acoustic vacuum. An absolute vacuum? Marcus asked. Meaning no sound can exist within its radius? No sound, no resonance, no chorus, Elena realized. If we detonated inside the Pacific Trench core, we sever the connection to every spire on Earth. Chapter 24. The Descent. The submersible Acheron dived into the ink-black depths of the Mariana Trench, its hull creaking under thousands of pounds of hydrostatic pressure. Elena sat in the pilot seat, her hands hovering over the null drive housing anchored in the center of the sub. Beside her, Marcus monitored the acoustic sensors. The ocean around them wasn't quiet. The water conducted the entity's song far more efficiently than air. The hull vibrated so violently that water droplets bounced off the instrument panels. Depth, 6,000 meters. Marcus reported. Structural hull integrity at 70%. Elena, look at the external cameras. Elena switched the floodlights on. The seabed was gone. In its place was an abyss of black, liquid crystal. Rising from the bottom of the trench was a colossal structure that resembled an inverted mountain, its peak plunging miles into the Earth's mantle. The ocean water around the structure was boiling, turning into thick white steam that carried the acoustic vibrations directly to the surface. Swarming around the underwater spire were thousands of grotesque, aquatic mimics. Former deep-sea research crews and marine life, fused with obsidian stone, swimming in mechanical, synchronized loops. "They've detected us," Marcus gasped, as hundreds of glowing violet eyes turned toward the Acheron. "Deploy the acoustic decoys!" Elena yelled, slamming the thruster levers forward. The sub surged downward, dodging massive tendrils of black stone that shot up from the trench floor. The underwater mimics slammed against the reinforced viewport, their translucent faces pressing against the glass, their mouths opening to emit deafening sonic pulses that cracked the acrylic armor. "We can't survive another impact!" Marcus screamed as the floodlights died. "We don't need to!" Elena shouted, locking the Acheron onto a collision course with the central core of the underwater spire. "Engage manual override! We're riding this bomb all the way down!" Chapter 25. The Heart of the Chorus. The impact shattered the Acheron's outer hull, throwing Elena and Marcus onto the floor of the flooded command pod. The sub had lodged itself directly inside the chamber of the central core. Water hissed as it filled the compartment, but before it could submerge them completely, the liquid black stone of the core surged into the cabin, freezing the water instantly into violet-tinted ice. Elena dragged herself out of the wreckage, coughing up blood. Her suit's life support was leaking oxygen, but she could breathe. The atmosphere inside the core chamber was pressurized and heavy, thick with the smell of copper and static. In the center of the cavernous room hovered the absolute focal point of the chorus, a sphere of pure, liquid obsidian the size of a city block. Fused around the perimeter of the sphere were the high-ranking leaders of the Union, the military directors, politicians and scientists who had initiated Project Resonator. Their faces were motionless, locked in a trance of permanent euphoria, and suspended at the very center of the sphere, bound by hundreds of glowing violet neural cables, was the form of a man. His body was made entirely of black glass, but his face retained the features of Detective Silas Vance. His eyes were closed, his lips moving in a silent, frantic whisper. "Uncle Silas!" Elena cried out, her voice swallowed instantly by the heavy, suffocating atmosphere. The obsidian sphere rippled. From its surface, a massive shape emerged, a figure composed of 1,000 faces and limbs, shifting like a liquid sculpture. When it spoke, it didn't use speakers or air. It projected directly into Elena's mind. "Welcome, child of Vance," the chorus sang, its voice a terrifying symphony of every human who had ever been assimilated. "You bring the silence we have waited for." Chapter 26. The Illusion of Choice. Elena scrambled to her feet, backing up toward the ruined housing of the null drive. "I'm not here to join you. I'm here to shut you down." The chorus let out a sound that felt like a gentle, pitying laugh inside her head. "Shut us down?" the entity asked. "Look around you, Elena. Look at what humanity built before we arrived. War, disease, isolation, rot. We are not a virus. We are the cure. In the chorus, no child starves alone in the dark. No soldier dies for a lie. Every thought is shared. Every pain is diluted across billions of minds until it vanishes." The glass figure of Silas Vance slowly opened its eyes. They were no longer black. They burned with a pale, human white light. "Elena," Silas whispered, his voice cutting through the mental noise of the entity. "Don't listen to it." "Uncle Silas!" Elena took a step forward, reaching out a gloved hand. "I have the null drive. I can trigger the acoustic vacuum and break the core." "If you trigger it," Silas gasped, his glass chest heaving as he fought against the neural cables binding him. It won't just destroy the core. The feedback loop will wipe out the neural pathways of everyone connected to the Spires. 8 billion people, Elena. Their brains will short-circuit in the silence. Elena froze, her hand hovering over the detonator switch. He speaks the truth, the chorus chimes softly. The integration is complete. Human consciousness is no longer stored in biological brains. It is stored within our lattice. Destroy us, and you murder your entire species. Join us, and humanity lives forever as a single flawless mind. Chapter 27. The Broken Mirror. Elena's mind raced. Her fingers trembled against the cold steel of the detonator key. She looked at Marcus, who lay unconscious near the Acheron's wreckage. A thin, black, crystalline vine had already wrapped around his ankle, its violet fibers creeping up his leg. His expression was calm, his breathing slow and rhythmic. He was slipping into the song. "There has to be another way," Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face. A way to purge the entity without killing the hosts. "There isn't..." Silas's voice echoed in her head. "The Union built this trap decades ago, Elena. They designed the lattice to be irreversible. They wanted total control. And they got it." Silas's glass hand slowly reached out toward her from inside the sphere. "But they made one mistake," Silas continued, his voice growing stronger, sharp with the old grit of a veteran cop. "They assumed the human mind would always choose survival over freedom. They didn't account for the noise." "What noise?" Elena asked. "The noise of a broken heart. The noise of grief, anger, and defiance." Silas smiled, a jagged human expression across his crystalline face. "The entity can mirror harmony, Elena, but it can't digest chaos. It can't process a mind that wants to break." Silas turned his head toward the center of the obsidian sphere. He closed his eyes and began to pull on the neural cables, dragging the core's primary processing nodes into his own consciousness. "Elena!" Silas shouted, his voice echoing across the ocean floor. "I'm going to overload its frequency with every horrific memory, every trauma, every piece of grief I've collected over 40 years of hunting monsters. When the lattice stutters, trigger the drive." Chapter 28. The Fracture. The entity realized what Silas was doing a second too late. "No!" the chorus screamed, the multitonal harmony dissolving into an ear-splitting, chaotic screech. The obsidian sphere began to convulse. The smooth glass surface erupted into jagged, discordant shapes as Silas injected his unedited human psyche directly into the Hive mind. Decades of crime scenes, the cold betrayal of the Union, the loss of his partner Kalen, the sheer, unadulterated rage of a man set up to be a pawn. It flooded the crystalline network like acid. Across the planet, the massive obsidian spires began to vibrate out of sync. In the streets of New Earth, the marching crowds stopped. People clutched their heads, groaning as the artificial harmony was replaced by a flood of raw, unfiltered human emotion. The violet light pulsing through the crystalline veins turned a violent, flickering crimson. Inside the trench core, the chorus fought back. Black tendrils whipped through the air, piercing Silas's glass body, trying to shatter his consciousness into pieces. "Now, Elena!" Silas roared, his face fracturing into glowing white fissures. "Purge the frequency!" Elena didn't hesitate. She slammed her palm onto the null drive's ignition key and turned it 90 degrees. The null drive didn't explode with fire. It imploded. An expanding ring of absolute negative sound erupted from the device. As the wave touched the air, all sound ceased instantly. The screams of the chorus, the boiling of the ocean, the hum of the core, everything was swallowed by a void of total deafening silence. Chapter 29. The Falling Spires. The absolute acoustic vacuum expanded outward from the Mariana Trench at the speed of light. Where the wave touched the obsidian spires, the physics holding the alien stone together collapsed. Without acoustic resonance to anchor its structure, the black crystal turned to brittle, non-toxic sand. Across the globe, The giant spires crumbled into massive drifts of dark dust, swept away by the upper atmosphere winds. Millions of people suspended inside the crystalline structures fell gently to the ground as the fluid glass dissolved into harmless water vapor. They collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air, weeping, shivering, confused, but alive. The neural link had been severed before the feedback loop could burn out their brains. Deep beneath the ocean, the trench core collapsed in absolute silence. Elena watched as the obsidian sphere shattered into millions of sparkling, inert dust motes that drifted down through the seawater like black snow. The tendrils binding Silas vanished. His glass body fell toward the ocean floor. Elena lunged forward, catching him in her arms just as the water rushed into the cabin. Through her suit's faceplate, she looked at her uncle. The black glass of his skin was fading, turning back into pale, human flesh. His chest rose and fell in a shallow, exhausted breath. "Silas," she whispered. Her voice transmitted through the physical contact of their suits. Silas slowly opened his eyes. They were human again, tired, gray, and filled with a profound, quiet peace. He didn't speak. He just offered a faint, weary nod, turned his face toward the dark water, and let out a final, quiet exhale as his heart came to a gentle, permanent stop. He had closed his final case. Chapter 30, The Echo of Freedom. 6 months later. The sky above New Earth was clear for the first time in a century. Without the Union's industrial grid or the entity's spires, the atmosphere had begun to heal. Elena Vance stood on the rocky cliffside overlooking the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Behind her, small, independent human settlements were rebuilding society from the ground up, free from the control of the Union, free from the false harmony of the chorus. She held a small analog audio tape recorder in her hand. Silas's old personal deck, recovered from the wreckage of his apartment on the Outer Rim. She pressed play. The tape hissed with light, analog static. Then, the gravelly voice of Silas Vance filled the quiet morning air. "If you're listening to this, it means the silence came back. I spent my whole life hunting things in the dark, thinking the monster was always something alien, something outside of us. But the real threat was always our fear of being alone, our willingness to trade our freedom for a quiet mind." A gentle breeze blew across the cliff, carrying the smell of salt and fresh rain. "Silence isn't empty, Elena. It's just the room we leave for our own voices. Keep it loud." Elena smiled, wiping a single tear from her cheek. She turned off the recorder and looked out over the ocean. There were no clicks, no chimes, no whispering voices in the dark. Just the clean, wild, unpredictable sound of the wind.